Hi, hello, welcome. I'm Trina. Nice to meet you. If you're new here, welcome. If you're not new here, that would surprise me because this is a very new channel. This is only my second ever monthly wrap-up, and for the first time, it's a wrap-up where I'm talking about books that I kind of read in YouTube videos. So some of these I'm going to go through pretty quickly because I've made whole videos about them already, so I don't want to waste too much time. I've also read a lot of books this month. I read 18 books. I have read more in previous months this year, but those were months where I had a lot less going on in my life, and more of the books were like graphic novels or very short stories. Some of the books I read this month were massive and I feel like should count as 2 books or 3 books, but I got through them. And I'm really glad that I did. I found some incredible books this month. I think I ended up with 7 5-star reads this month, which is crazy because I was actively trying to be stricter with my ratings, and if a book wasn't perfect, not give it 5 stars. I just read a lot of perfect books this month, what can I say? And I was really happy with all of them. I think I also saved a lot of books that I knew I would like for this month, specifically because I knew I was starting a YouTube channel, so I wanted to read some anticipated books in specific videos that I made, so that might have also been why I had so many grouped up. Or maybe it was just also because I really got into the spooky season this year. Halloween was really fun for me, and I read a lot of great books leading up to Halloween, and I read a lot of un-Halloweeny books just out where the Halloween decorations are in my neighborhood, and that made them feel more fall. So I just had a great time overall with all of them. I did read quite a few books, and this would be a very long video if I went into depth on all of them, so I'm going to try to go pretty quickly through all of them. Please feel free to leave a comment if you read any of these books and you want to talk more about them in the comments, or if you are thinking about reading any of these books and you want more information about them, I'm always happy to oblige. But I will start out trying to go through this pretty quickly for everyone's sake. Diving in, I started this month with 2 really good romance reads. Well, one was romantasy, I guess, but the first one was Emily Wilde's Encyclopedia of Faeries. I read this as a library book on my Kindle, and I really enjoyed this, surprisingly. I've gotten some questionable recommendations from YouTube before, but this one was actually up my alley. I really enjoyed it. The ambiance was really nice. It felt super wintry. It felt like, God, the location, the setting almost felt like I was reading a Moomin story. Kind of that setting. It's set in northern Scandinavia, which is where I'm from, so it was really, I enjoyed the place setting of it as well, and I really loved the main character. I felt like she was very relatable to me. She was kind of the grumpy one in the relationship in the book, and she was very focused on her academics, and she was very annoyed with everyone who got in the way of her academics, and I love that dynamic. I love when the woman is the grumpy one. Or I just love, in general, romance dynamics that play on differences from a norm, I would say. I also I loved with the romance in this book, it kind of felt like the characters knew about it before the reader does, which seems self-explanatory, but most romance books, it's the opposite. It's like the reader can pick up the signs that they're in love before the characters even notice. But in this case, the characters had this unspoken thing going before the book even started, and the readers slowly let in on their unspoken thing, and that makes it feel like an even more intimate relationship dynamic, so I liked the way that that was done as well. And yeah, I'm really excited to pick up the sequel. I probably would have, but I was trying to cut down on my Kindle books this month. You'll see I did not manage to do that, but I really was trying, so I'll probably end up picking up the sequel this month while I'm doing some traveling because I have it all set up and checked out from the library, so I'm excited to do that. And the second romance book I read in the first week of the month was a sequel. It was You Should Be So Lucky by Sebastian. This is a historical romance that I talked about reading the first book in this duology. I think it might be more in the future, but for now it's just a duology. I read the first book, We Could Be So Good, in September, loved it, gave it 5 stars. Read We Should Be So Lucky, loved it, gave it 5 stars. I think the relationship dynamic in We Could Be So Good is still my favorite of the 2, but I couldn't not give You Should Be So Lucky 5 stars because it was so beautifully written. The character dynamics were amazing, and the individual characters I loved even more, I think, than the original characters. It's kind of like a trade-off. First book, I liked the relationship connection more. Second book, I liked the individual characters more. So both of them had great things about them. I think Cat Sebastian always slays the historical setting and the research. And there's something about the amount of research and care she puts into the setting that just makes the book come alive even more than you think it could just ordinarily. And so I really don't think that research and the effort she puts in is wasted. And there were also these incredible themes of like self-doubt and grief and grief recovery. And obviously, same as the first book, amazing themes around queerness in the 1960s in New York and what that was like, and that was really well done. There's also some baseball in this book, which ordinarily I wouldn't care about, but I've been getting so many TikToks about Shohei Ohtani and how amazing he is, and I love him. So now I find myself weirdly caring about baseball more than I did. So maybe 6 months ago, this book wouldn't have been as good, but since recently I've actually cared slightly more about baseball, then it was pretty interesting to read around that same time period. So I had a really good time with this, and I definitely recommend both of the books in this duology. I was so impressed. They're probably some of my favorite romance books of all time, honestly. They're so, so good. And then next up, I have some books that I read for reading vlogs that I was doing. So I went into enormous exhaustive detail on them already, so I will try to go through pretty quickly. Starting off, we had books I read that were autumnal themed for my autumnal reading vlog. We have If We Were Villains by M.L. Rio. Look at this edition I found. It's a signed edition. Now I have 2 signed editions. ML Rio just loves my local bookshop. What can I say? There's always signed editions from her there. An incredible, incredible book. I recommend going to watch the video because I lost my mind over this book and I'm still thinking about it, and I still go back and I look through my tabs I read this copy in the back. So I still go back to that copy and look through my tabs in here and read my favorite quotes again and again. So, so good. ML Rio does character relationships in this book so well. This like unspoken tension between the characters like had me going insane. And I think the main thing that makes this book so, so good is that it nails the ending. The ending of this book absolutely slays. I still think about it on the regular. It's like probably the most perfect ending I've read in ages. I was so shook. So yeah, 5 stars, absolutely. New favorite. Will probably reread every year, honestly, because I already want to reread it and it's only been like 3 weeks. So yeah, loved to death. Highly, highly recommend. And then I read in that same video An Education in Malice by S.T. Gibson. Weirdly, I have actually thought a lot about this book since finishing it, so maybe I was too harsh but it is sapphic, so I think more about sapphic books than I would the average regular book. But this is a vampire Carmilla retelling on a college campus. It's supposed to be kind of dark academia-y with vampires. I was not a huge fan. I think the writing was really poorly done and the characters were very, very flat. And I spent a lot of time complaining about this book already, so I will try not to complain about it even more here. Overall, I would just say, if you want Carmilla, read Carmilla. Or there are so many like sapphic Carmilla-y stories out there that I think you can do better than this one that specifically tries to market itself very strongly as a Carmilla retelling by using the exact same character names, but totally loses all the vibes and ambiance that made Carmilla so good that I think you can find in other books that aren't explicitly retellings. So, yeah. And then I read Model Home by Rivers Solomon. This was 100% an amazing book, 5-star read. It's not on my list of all-time favorite books, I think because it's competing sort of with Sorrowland, Rivers Solomon's other book that's on my all-time favorites list. But yeah, I think sci-fi is gonna always hit harder for me, which is why Sorrowland is so much more emotional and close to my heart. But this was still incredible, so, so good. All the horror aspects hitting with so much symbolism and meaning. This book is a take on the haunted house where it deals with the haunted house kind of as a symbolism for racism in the suburbs, specifically when the main character of this book was growing up in the Texas suburbs in the 90s, and that sort of dynamic, and using the haunted house as a way to explore those kinds of themes of blackness in the suburbs in the 90s and like the horrors that they went through, and also queerness in the main character, but River Solomon does that in all of their books and they do it so well. So yeah, their books are always going to slay for me, but this one especially was perfect for this holiday season. Perfect horror, spooky novel. Loved death. And then to keep the string of amazing books going, I read Northanger Abbey by Jane Austen in that video. This book totally took me by surprise. I knew I would love it because of Jane Austen's writing, which I know I love. I didn't realize I would love it. And it became, I think it's my second favorite, might be tied for first favorite Jane Austen with Pride and Prejudice. This is about a young girl who is going out in society for the first time. She goes to the city of Bath in England, where I've been, so I could picture it so clearly in my head. She's very naive about the ways of society, but she really wants to do right. She wants to be a good person and do right by society while also being young and carefree. And she learns some hard lessons in the process, but those lessons are told in such a funny, witty, sarcastic way. I love Jane Austen's humor in this book. And then in the second half of the novel, they shift to this old abbey, Northanger Abbey, that has great like gothic fall vibes, all the while Jane Austen's narration is making fun of the gothic vibes. So it's just like a great combination of things that I love, and this will probably also become a new fall reread for me, because yeah, incredible. And then I made another reading vlog on high fantasy books that kind of took me the entire month because these books were so long. Starting off for that video, I read a novella called The Brides of High Hill by Nikole. It is the fourth or the fifth, I think it might be the fifth book in the Singing Hills cycle, which is a series of novellas set in the same universe following a cleric called Nghi, who belongs to the Singing Hills Abbey, which is an abbey of clerics, and the clerics and their companion birds go around the land that they live in and collect stories to bring back and build a comprehensive history of their world. That's like what their task is. So most of the books so far have been Cleric Nghi meeting with somebody and hearing their story, and we're told the story that they're recording. This was the first novella in the series where Nghi is making the history. Cleric Nghi is kind of a part of what's happening in the story actively. And I found that really fun. I really had a good time with it. It was too short. I wanted more, but I think with the future novellas in this series, I might have a better time if I reread all the previous ones leading up so that I have a little bit more build up, as opposed to this novella I kind of crammed into a video with two massive epic fantasies. So it kind of fell short because of that, but overall it was still really good, and I still really recommend this series of novellas because I've enjoyed all of them and the writing is really beautiful. And then the second book I read in that video was Malice by Gwynne. Is this a library book? Yes, it is tabbed. Yes, I still have it. I've forgotten to turn it in. Even though I said I did, but I didn't. No one else is checking out this book, so it keeps getting automatically renewed and I keep forgetting to turn it in. So I thought I'd use it for this video. This is a epic fantasy set in the Banished Lands, which is a land of men that also is occupied by a number of fantastical species like giants and other creatures that are being slowly explored. And this first book follows the beginnings of what is going to become a 4-book series and a 4-book long conflict. So it goes kind of slowly in the beginning as we're introduced to a large cast of characters, particularly Corbin, who's a young boy that clearly has some sort of epic destiny awaiting him, and Veratus, who believes he's following a prince who is destined to be like this world's Jesus. But then he slowly starts realizing things are wrong, and a lot is revealed, a lot happens over the course of this book. There's a lot crammed in here. I had a really good time with it. It's very classic epic fantasy. You'll find nothing more straightforward than this. The chapters were fairly short, so it didn't feel like I was like struggling to get through it at all. It was a great tempo, great pace in world building. You were not like overwhelmed with information either, other than the requisite first 50 pages of every fantasy novel where you're always overwhelmed with information. But yeah, loved this. I recommend. I had a good time. And then lastly for that video, I read Royal Assassin by Robin Hobb. what can I say that all of these tabs can't say? This was beautifully written, a perfect continuation to the first book. Put the first book to shame, honestly. Put every single fantasy book I've ever read to shame. So incredible. I love all the characters that Robin Hobb writes. You get really attached to all of them. You get really attached to all their stories. She takes you by surprise with the level of suffering she's willing to put these characters through, honestly. Devastating. But the world building is also really good. It's somewhat insulated. It's not like the same kind of grand scale that you see in something like Malice. It's pretty much kept to this one area, Buckkeep Castle, with occasional explorations outward. But I think the next book in the series is going to open up the world. And for God's sake, this is a 16-book series. There's plenty of time to open up the world and explore new locations. So I really like the way that Robin Hobb is going at it, where she's not trying to introduce you to 10 million locations. It's about introducing you to these characters on like a really intimate and personal level so that you get as attached to them as I did. And she does that so well. And I'm only 2 books in, and I would still recommend this series to anybody because the first 2 books, even on their own, have just been great experiences. So highly recommend. And if the trend continues, this book only improved upon book 1. So I'm really hoping they keep improving on themselves because I can't wait to see it. And then in the meantime, I was picking up a couple of audiobooks. I'm a big audiobook listener when I'm out on walks. I really like walking places to read outdoors. So on my walks, I also listen to audiobooks a lot and really enjoy those. I listened to 3 audiobooks this month. The first one was very, very long. It was the 1619 Project. I think it was like a 19-hour audiobook. But oh my god, it was so worth it. This was easy 5 stars. Absolutely incredible. I recommend this book, both the audiobook production and the actual book if you're more of a reader and not a listener. Basically, this book is a comprehensive history of Black Americans from the year 1619 to today, and how Black history is intimately intertwined with American history in such an inseparable way, and going over all of these things that you may have not been taught in history class because of our curriculum missing out on so many aspects of slavery that were so impactful in American history. So yeah, it really goes into depth about the legacy of slavery in America, and it kind of is set up chronologically, which I think is really smart. So each chapter is divided into its own category of content. So one is about specifically the economy, one is specifically about, God, I'm forgetting the categories now. There was one about music. There was one about traffic, interestingly enough. There was, so many individual categories that they then put in a somewhat chronological order so that you could like follow along. But in general, each chapter kind of swaths over a large, broad time period in history. So it was a really interesting read. And then the audiobook production was incredible because each section is narrated, most of them I would say, were narrated by the people that wrote them. So they get to like put their own voice into it, and in the in-between chapters, they feature short stories and poetry about historical events that they're talking about that are also narrated by the authors. Loved. This was a book that I feel like the audiobook just enhanced the experience. I loved it. It was so beautiful. I really do think this should be required reading for most people. I think that like, especially if you enjoy American history and you want a different perspective on it, then you have to read this book. And then the second audiobook I read or listened to, I still don't really know what I should be saying there, but the second audiobook I listened to was a short story collection called The Office of Historical Corrections. This was kind of the opposite. This was kind of a dud for me. It was not, especially on audiobook, I don't recommend, because some of these short stories are just like either painfully boring or painfully cringy to read. I think I remember writing down when I was reading this, I was like, this feels like someone put in a bunch of random prompt generators and was just like pulling random things out and meshing them together into stories. Like it just felt very under explored, the characters in a lot of the short stories. But I did end up giving it 3 stars because the title story, The Office of Historical Corrections, that short story was really, really good. That was really interesting. It was much longer. I think it was like the last 40% of this collection was just that title story. So we got more time with the characters that were way more interesting and so heartbreaking. And there were levels and there was up and down, and there was setup and there was conclusion and all the stuff that I felt like the earlier stories in this collection were missing. So I definitely don't recommend the audiobook because I ended up just having to skip whole stories that I couldn't skim because I'm listening on audiobook. So if I can't skim it, then it was like painful to have to listen to. Like I was really struggling with the first 50% of this, but I do recommend the title story if you want to just pick it up for that. I thought that was really good. And then my third audiobook that I finished just this last week, the last week of the month, was In the Dream House by Carmen Maria Machado. This was so beautiful. I gave it 5 stars. I think I kind of wish I had read the physical book. Not that the audiobook wasn't incredible, because I will always recommend listening to audiobooks of memoirs, because mostly only when the authors themselves, if it's their story and they're telling it, because I think that's so beautiful and it's a way to like feel the content of a memoir more intimately when the author is narrating. But in this case, the writing was so beautiful that I kind of wish I had a physical copy to like annotate along with. So I might do that in the future, and I think that would just enhance my experience of reading this. But yeah, beautiful, beautiful conceptual novel. A lot of times concept books don't really work for me because they kind of get old by the end. But in this case, because it was a memoir, it just worked. It was a very short memoir as well. I think the audiobook was only like 6 hours. And it was this perfect meshing of non-fiction sources about abuse, particularly queer abuse, mixed in with Carmen's own story and her creative tellings of it and her highlights of very specific events in her life that sort of shaped this narrative. I just thought it was beautifully written and a really unique way to do the memoir. So loved it. Love beautifully written memoirs always. I can't really say yet if this is going to end up being like a favorite of all time. I think I want to reread the physical version before I say that for sure, but I can say that it's really good and that I highly recommend because it was really good and I highly recommend. Other miscellaneous reads I did before the end of the month, Kindle and physical book reads that I scattered throughout the month. Starting off, I read Celestial Monsters. Oh god, I do not remember the author's name. Oh, by Aiden Thomas. My bad, sorry. Celestial Monsters by Aiden Thomas. This is the sequel to The Sunbearer Trials. This is a young adult fantasy. Yeah, I think it's a young adult fantasy, kind of like Percy Jackson in terms of like, it's about children of gods, but in this case specifically about the children of the Aztec gods, and it's building on Aztec mythology. I enjoyed these books. Obviously, I read the second book, so even though I didn't rate the first book that much, I still wanted to read the second book. But at the end of the day, there is a really, really annoying character, I think her name is Naya, in these books, that bothered me in book 1, but then she became an even more prominent character in book 2, and I just could not deal with her. It's like one of those cases where because it's a middle grade book, then the author needs to have like a comic relief character. I hate comic relief characters that serve no other purpose. She was really, really frustrating and said a lot of like really rude things, and just no one was calling her out on it. And it was just like a painful character to read, especially as she became a character in book 2. But I appreciate the fact that these books aren't for me because they're middle grade. They're not meant for me. So I would still maybe read them for someone at the middle grade reading level. But yeah, I wanted to finish the series because I loved one of the main characters, Aurelio, so much. He is so relatable to me. He's this like shy, awkward person who feels like he's not doing enough and just loves his sister. Like, love Aurelio so much. I wish somehow he was a main character in book 2, and I feel like I did not get enough of him. Like, we deserved more Aurelio overall, and less Naya, for the love of God. But yeah, overall, they were fine. I'm glad I finished the duology. They just weren't like perfect, but they were fine. And then I read 1,000 Splendid Suns by Khaled Husseini. I recently also read The Kite Runner last month, and I think this book was an even more, intimate experience for me because it has women main characters. I felt like The Kite Runner was all about boy main characters and their relationship with other boys and like growing up with a father, like father-son relationships, all of that. This was a book about mother-daughter relationships and sisters and friendships between women, and that hit harder for me. I think The Kite Runner is probably the more well-written book because it definitely feels more personal to Khaled Husseini. Like, this book is about an experience that's not maybe as intimate to the author, so it kind of, I don't know, you can just sense that, like, when reading them back to back, I would definitely recommend separating them out more than I did. I think reading them back to back just, like, made me compare them way more strongly. Yeah, I still absolutely loved this book, and I do recommend both of them in either order, but I especially recommend this book if you read The Kite Runner and were like, where are the women? They're in this book. And they're really beautifully written, and I love them dearly, and I just want them to be happy. This book, like, crushed my soul. I was reading this on a bus to New York that I'm gonna post a reading vlog for at some point, but I was like, I can't cry, I'm on a bus, I'm in public. But overall, I loved both of them, and this one was probably even more personal to me than The Kite Runner was, so I loved it, and I do highly recommend. And then on that same trip, I also read Everything Leads to You by Nina LaCour. This is a romance book set in LA between a girl working on a movie set, like who's an intern on a movie set, with a young actress that she finds through a series of coincidental events that kind of, like, everything leads them to each other. I liked this. It's not my favorite romance book of all time or anything, but I had a good time with it. I really liked the setting and the main characters. They felt very real. Their reactions, the dialogue wasn't cringy, everything felt very, like, emotional and understandable, and there was clearly a lot of research done into the film industry and how it works for this book, because that all felt very realistic, which I enjoyed. I would say that it felt weird that the main characters were, like, 17, 18. They didn't need to be 17, 18 for the purposes of the story. Like, I almost feel like when I read a book now, I'm turning old, but when I read romance books now with, like, 17, 18-year-olds, I'm like, they're not gonna last. Because you change so much in your early 20s, I feel like. Or even, that's just all I've experienced. I'm sure I'm going to change more. But I just feel like the story plot did not revolve around them being in high school whatsoever. So they could have, like, they had real jobs in the real world, which kind of felt unbelievable for 17, 18-year-olds. So I just feel like it would have made more sense for them to be in their early to mid-20s. And the story would have worked just as well, and it would have felt less weird at some points. But I did still like it. And I still recommend giving it a shot because I liked it. And then lastly, just yesterday, I finished up a reading vlog with books that I was specifically reading for Halloween. I have a very busy November ahead of me, so I was like, this is my last chance to, like, sit down and do, like, a little reading vlog situation. So I decided to pick up 3 Halloween-y books I decided were Halloween-y. The first one that I finished was Hampton Heights by Dan Coy, that I kind of just randomly picked up in my bookstore because it was a signed copy, and I was like, it's really short, and it kind of is giving me Halloween vibes in the front. You can see, like, the little drawn werewolf on the side and everything. I just loved. I had a decent time with this. There were parts I really liked. There were parts I didn't really like. I kind of go into it more in that reading vlog, but this book is about 6 middle school age prepper boys, which is my first complaint. Why are they in middle school? They don't act like middle schoolers. Who are out in a late winter night trying to sell people on newspaper subscriptions. Why are they doing this in the middle of the night? Why are they doing it in a sketchy neighborhood? I don't know. But they divide into groups of 2, and we follow each of the pairs' individual stories. So the book is divided into 3 sections, which makes it really easy for me to say that I didn't like the first story. The first story was fine. Like, solid, like, 3 stars. 3 stars. The main character, Sigmund, didn't really act like a middle schooler, and it was just kind of random. I feel like that story maybe would have hit harder later on when we were more attached to the writing. I don't know. And then the second story, I really didn't like at the same time as I really did like it. It was one of those, like, hard ones where it was just kind of weird that they were in middle school. And it was also kind of disappointing because I thought the second story would be my favorite because that's the one with queer characters. But there were just some weird consent issues written in that I just felt like were dealt with very poorly, or not dealt with at all. So, but I really loved the last story in here and how that, like, then bleeds into the conclusion. And I had a good time with that, so I feel like I ended on a high note with it. And even though it's not even set on Halloween, it should have been set on Halloween. It's giving Halloween vibes. It's like them going door to door with subscriptions is like trick-or-treaters, so I had a decent time with this, but nothing that's gonna stick in my memory. And then I finished Ninth House by Leigh Bardugo, which has been on my bookshelf, my TBR, for ages, and I'm so glad I finally picked this up. Although, in hindsight, maybe I should have split it up more from If We Were Villains, because I kept comparing the 2 of them, And nothing was gonna compare to If We Were Villains for me, so this was still really good. I gave it 4.5 stars, but maybe it could have been a 5-star to me if I was in a different headspace. I don't know. I'll probably reread this at some point, honestly. It was very rereadable. But this is set on the Yale campus, and it's a dark academia fantasy about a main character who is recruited by the college to work for their, like, fantasy control system, where she, like, has to monitor these, like, rich white boys on campus who are using magic and make sure they're not using it, like, unfairly or hurting people in the process. So it deals a lot with that kind of, like, outsider perspective in on these academic circles and what it's like for Alex to be a part of this world that she's never really gonna belong to, as much as because she's not there because of anything she's done or earned, but just because they brought her in for it. So I think it really deals with that side of academia really well, and I loved that. And I liked the fantasy in here. I think the fantasy worked really well as this thing that's, like, only for the elites, kind of similar to Babel in that respect, that, like, there's magic, but it's reserved for the elites, and it only benefits the elites. So what is the point of magic in a system like that? And you kind of see how the world is exactly the same as our own world, because magic isn't readily available to everyone. So that kind of comparison I have really been enjoying in these dark academia books, and I think it's done really well, and offers a good contemplation on the nature of magic in the contemporary setting. So I go into it more in that reading vlog, but I loved it. And then lastly, I finished up the month with House of Hunger by Alexis Henderson. This was fine. It had decent vibes. There were just a couple of things in here that made me kind of uncomfortable. I think it was the weakness of this book is in its world building and in its setup. Like, sometimes, you know, when you're reading books and you're like, okay, the author has this concept and they just want to get the characters to the concept. So they have, like, a really weak setup and intro just to get the characters where they want them to be. That's what this kind of felt like. But once the characters were where the author wanted them to be, really interesting, and I loved the ending, and I loved the dynamics between the characters in this. I thought that was really well done. And it was a great spooky vampire-y read. And also, I don't think I ever said this in that reading vlog, but I love this cover. Normally I don't like covers with real people on them, but this one that's like a painting of this girl is exactly how I pictured the main character in this book. It's so beautiful and haunting and perfect. So I actually really do love, this is the first, like, real person cover that I actually really loved. But yeah, I had a good time with this. I definitely recommend it as, like, a spooky season read, but it had its issues that I forgave by the end, I would say. What did I rate this? I think I rated it 3.5 stars. To balance out in the beginning, I was like 2 stars. And then I was like, okay, 3 stars. And then at the end, I was like 4 stars. I'm like, okay, we'll give it a generous 3.5. That's kind of where I ended up with this month, ending it on a spooky read. I think I finished this November 1st, but I read most of it in October, so I'm counting it for October overall. Those were all the books I read in October. A great collection. I didn't read as many from my physical TBR as maybe I was planning on. Overall, I would say I'm still really happy with this reading month. I may not have gotten to my full list, but I read, like, a great spread of 5-star books. And honestly, I think, you know what it might have been? So many of these books on this list ended up becoming 5 stars that I think by the end I was kind of like, I don't want to read more 5 stars. I like to spread out my 5 stars. I don't need to clump them all together in one month. So a lot of these books that I haven't read yet are probably going to be 5 stars when I get around to them, and I'm happy to spread them out a little bit more. So that's what I'll say about that. Thank you so much for sticking around. This is a really long wrap-up because I had a lot to say about these books. A lot of books, lots to talk about. But thank you for sticking around. Thank you for watching. I hope you had a great reading month in October, and I hope you have an even better one in November. As always, please leave a comment if you want to talk more about any of these books. I'm always happy to. Or just leave a comment to say, like, hey, I stayed to the end of this video, because that is really cool. So thank you for watching, and have a great day. I will see you in the next one. Bye.